Awesome. All right. Well, this is our second in the series of Lunch and Learn webinars for the year. And today it's being hosted by Hitch. And Hitch are a gold partner with the Franchise Council, and they are a boutique law firm, and their niche is in franchising. So there's a fair bit of information here today. We've got Joel Marshall on. He's the principal of Hitch, and he's going to be talking about leasing in franchising, which is all very important to all of us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Joel.
Thank you very much, Helen. Pleasure to be on today. So I will just start sharing. Here we go. Let's see if this works. All right, is that showing up?
Yep.
Everyone's screens? Perfect. So as Helen mentioned, I will be talking about leasing in the context of franchising today. So there'll be parts of it that are going to be relevant to franchisees, parts to franchisors. As always, a little disclaimer here, even though I am a lawyer, this is not legal advice. It's provided for general educational and informational purposes only.
Going on that webinar? Yes. That's really good.
I know, right? I'm like trying to get a little checklist of
So I'm going to cover sort of three main parts today. I'm going to talk to some of the key lease provisions you need to be looking out for, both generally and in a franchising context. Next, we'll be talking about some of the different ways you can structure your leasing arrangements. And then lastly, we'll talk about, well, what sort of franchise systems might suit the different structures and how to match the right structure to your system. So why does leasing matter in franchising? Look, whilst not all franchise systems are premises-based, many are, and where they are, the premises is often the most single valuable asset in the franchise relationship. So your site selection, your lease terms, and the structure of the leasing arrangements can ultimately determine the success or failure of that franchised outlet. From a franchisor's perspective, the ability to control or influence the lease is key to protecting your brand consistency and through to your exit options. For franchisees, it's all about, I guess, making sure you have a good understanding of the lease obligations and what those risks and liabilities look like, so you can manage that and make the best decision, ensuring the viability of your investment into your franchise brand. All right, so key lease provisions in franchising. So I'm going to cover some, this is certainly not exhaustive, but I'm going to be running through some of these key provisions. I'm going to talk about security, ranging from your security deposits through to personal corporate guarantees. Be talking about permitted use. What does the lease actually let you do? Does that align with the franchise system? I'll be talking about assignment and subletting. Can you license, for franchisors, is there provisions there where they can license it to their franchisees? We're talking about relocation and demolition clauses, really important, you're looking out for those. Make good obligations, incentives and clawbacks. Often people don't turn their mind to clawbacks, so it's important to run through those. Renewal and option terms, and then some other key provisions around outgoings, hours of trade, exclusivity, signage, insurance, and really making sure they are appropriate and aligned to the particular franchise system. All right, so personal guarantees and security. Look, there's no getting around it. Typically, landlords are going to, at least in the first instance, will require a personal guarantee, particularly where franchisees are holding the lease, often from franchisors too. And typically, this is going to be unlimited, so it will cover all liability under the lease. But it's always worth trying to negotiate liability caps in there. If people don't, I'm sure most people are relatively familiar with what a personal guarantee means, but it basically means you personally be liable for liabilities under the lease. So if you've got, personal assets, you own your family home, that's all at risk if you're on there as a personal guarantor. So wherever possible, I do recommend, it's always worth trying to negotiate those out. Sometimes that's going to mean proposing a higher security amount or bank guarantee. If you've got the sort of financial capacity to do that, it's worth considering, because ultimately, regardless of the strength of a franchise brand, any business is still a risk. Things can happen in the future, unforeseen circumstances. So if you can silo the lease liability risk to the entity and not you personally, it's always worth trying to do so. In terms of security, typically landlords are going to require a sort of security deposit, a cash bond, or a bank guarantee. Typically, I'd see that between 3 to 6 months rent. I have seen some high since COVID. I've seen some pushing up to sort of 9 months, even 12 months. But somewhere between 3 to 6 is usually the standard. It's important you have a look at what the lease says around the landlord's ability to call on that or require you to top up the security amounts. And also important you have a look if there's some express provisions there on the timing of that being returned to you at the end of the lease. I've seen circumstances where it's sort of silent on that, and landlords can really drag their feet, for a number of months before you get your security deposit or bank guarantee back, which obviously impacts cash flow. And where franchisors are going to be holding the head leases, it's important that the lease provisions actually speak to the ability for you to either allow franchisees to put up replacement security, or at the very least, you're getting back-to-back security from your franchisees. But wherever possible, there's no point both of you tying up, a bank guarantee. So back-to-back should ideally be avoided. Wherever possible, you want to negotiate with the landlord if you're a franchisor, where they will accept replacement or direct security from franchisees that you license to. Permitted use looks relatively self-explanatory, but it's really important that you check that what the lease actually tells you can do, that aligns with the particular franchise system. It's important to be careful around the drafting of these. You don't want it to be too narrow. You want, because the franchise system may evolve, products and services may change. And you don't want it to be too broad. From a franchisor's perspective, it's often good to tie it to trading under the particular name of that brand. It's just going to make it harder for a franchisee to trade in competition with you, and actually stay aligned with their restraint provisions if they exit your brand. Also really important, don't just rely on what the permitted use in the lease says. You need to check any zoning restrictions. If it's a strata building, you need to look at the bylaws. Is there any hurdles we need to overcome to actually be able to trade the way we want to? Assignment and subletting or licensing. So this is a really key provision particularly where franchisors are holding the lease and licensing down to franchisees. You really need to make sure that the lease actually allows for that. The standard provision is that there's going to be lessee cannot assign or sublet without the landlord's consent. Often that can't be unreasonably withheld. But where you are, a franchisor is holding the head lease, you actually want to draft some specific clauses in there that actually allow you as of right to license. Also really important if you're say a franchisee and you're looking at taking a bigger space than you actually need, and you are anticipating licensing or subletting some of that space to a third party. You can't rely on the fact that you can do that as of right. If you are proposing to do that, try and get prior consent or it included in the lease when you're actually negotiating it. Another sort of key part of assignment clauses is that often they're quite broad. It can be a deemed assignment if there's a change in control of the lessee entity, or and so that has big implications, particularly with if you're looking at restructuring the business, suddenly a landlord can actually hold that up, or if you are undergoing a sort of network-wide sale, then and there's a change of control, or sometimes it'll actually trigger clawbacks on incentives and things. So ideally, you want that as narrow as possible. Relocation and demolition clauses. So typically, you'd see these in your larger sort of or medium to larger shopping centres where they have a right to actually move you. Obviously, that has a huge impact, particularly, when you've funded fit out and everything on your site. So it's important you keep an eye out for these when you're looking at the leases. Look, if it is a retail lease, there is some statutory protections, but if it's a commercial lease, if it's not clearly stated within there around compensation and timing and all of that, it's really important you include that if they are proposing to include a relocation or demolition clause in there. Make good obligations. So these are basically what happens at the end of the lease on the expiry or earlier termination. Typically, you would see an obligation where you have to return that premises to the state it was in which you received it in. So that if you've undertaken substantial fit out and everything, often that means that unless there's a consent from the landlord for that to remain, you've got to strip that all out at your cost. So it's important you have a look at the clauses and understand those provisions around make good. And obviously, you should be factoring that into your sort of financial assessment of the viability of that particular site or franchise brand. Incentive clawbacks. So I touched on this briefly earlier. So often you'll see landlord incentives in a lease deal. That can be contribution to fit out. It can be rental waivers or abatements, reductions. Often there will be clauses, and these are sometimes they're included in the lease itself, or they'll sit in a separate side deed. And often they'll be subject to clawback arrangements, which basically means if the lease ends, is terminated or early, or if you actually assign the lease early, and this can extend to changes of control as well, and deemed assignments, well, you've got an obligation to actually pay back the landlord a portion or sometimes the full portion of the incentive they've granted to you. So it's really important you look out for these and really try and negotiate and really limit the clawback amounts and the timing, because I've seen these provisions sting a lot of people. It's often overlooked. Renewal and option terms, relatively self-explanatory. But I guess the key thing is ideally you want to make sure there is a renewal or an option term there. It's always better to have the option than not, to extend the lease. Look, typically it's going to be tied to a market review at the time. It's really important to make sure that these align with the franchise terms. Because we see it all the time where there's lease terms that aren't aligned with franchise terms, and it just creates this real burden and difficulty where parties have to make a call on renewing leases or franchise agreements, and often they'll actually be in breach of the franchise agreement because they've only got 3 years left to run on their lease. So really important, if you can, you align those from the start. And some of the other key considerations to look out for, really make sure you understand when you're entering into a lease, is the outgoings. What outgoings am I responsible for? If it's a retail lease, you would have got a clear breakdown of the estimated amounts of those in the disclosure document. If it's a commercial lease, often you'll need to actually ask the landlord to give you that estimate. The hours of trade, obviously making sure that aligns to the requirements of the particular franchise system. One of the things you need to be mindful of, particularly in your larger shopping centres, is they'll have mandatory trading hours. So you'll need to factor that in with your financial sort of assessment of the viability. Having a look at if there's exclusivity. Often your sort of larger shopping centres, you won't have that, but some of your small to medium sized ones, it's good to try and get exclusivity if you can. And then signage and insurance, really just making sure it's going to align with your particular franchise system and their requirements. And yeah, so also important to consider if it's a retail lease or a commercial lease. If it's a retail lease, each state has particular retail lease legislation, which gives statutory protections to lessees. You don't have that with commercial leases, so it's really important you're more robust in your review and negotiation on commercial leases, because if there's any gaps in there and if it's silent on provisions, it's not going to be picked up under the retail lease legislation. All right, so some of the practical tips when, negotiating on a lease, understanding who you're dealing with. So there's different types of landlords. Obviously, you've got our sort of major shopping centres, your Westfields, your Stocklands, and then you've got your sort of mum and dad property owners, often in sort of self-managed super fund investments. So they're going to have very different willingness to negotiate on certain terms. And it's important to understand what your non-negotiables are before you actually, you don't want to figure these out as you go. Before you actually start your negotiations, you need to be very clear what your non-negotiables are, what you are must-haves and you won't negotiate or depart from, what are nice-to-haves. And that may change depending on the different site. There might be a site that you're really excited about. It looks like it's a great location. The commercials are good. So you might be more willing to let go of some clauses or positions than you otherwise would have. Other terms suitable for the future. It's not just about thinking now. You need to think, okay, what does the next 5 or more years have on the cards? If you're a franchisor in particular, well, might there be a bit of a restructure, or are we looking at a sale in the next 5 years? Do we need to factor that into our clawback incentives and our deemed assignment provisions so that we don't get stung in the transaction or the restructure held up in the future? And also be brazen. So look, if you don't ask, you don't get. If you don't think a landlord will accept something, that's not a reason not to ask for it. I've seen a number of terms get over the line simply by asking. All right, so now, sorry, I forgot to mention, if anyone has questions throughout, maybe chuck them in the chat, and then at the end of it, we've allowed some Q&A, so we'll deal with those then. So structuring options. So there's basically three common approaches in a franchising context. Firstly, the franchisor holds the head lease and then grants a property license. Usually it's property license. Very rarely am I seeing subleases used these days, down to franchisees. Option two, the franchisee holds the lease directly, and then the franchisor will require a deed of re-entry or step and right, tripartite deed, whatever you want to call it. And then option three, which I guess is the simplest option, is franchisee holds the lease directly and there's no deed of re-entry or step and rights by the franchisor. So we'll go through each of those. So franchisor holding the head lease. So the franchisor would actually be the lessee. And there would be a separate document between the franchisor and the franchisee where they grant the franchisee the right to occupy and run the premises and run the business. So typically it's just a pass through of the rent and the outgoing. So all the lease obligations typically just pass through to the franchisee. And typically I'd see it structured where the franchisee actually puts up the security deposit or the bank guarantee. So the franchisor itself isn't actually being burdened by that. This is a really popular model with, I guess, any franchise system that where the lease is really important. There's substantial fit out, or they're in major shopping centres where otherwise it might be really difficult for a franchisee to actually be able to get a lease in there. So it gives the franchisor the maximum, amount of control of that site, so that they can sort of control what happens on the exit of that particular franchisee. Obviously the big risk is the fact, well, the franchisor holds liability under the lease directly, and whilst they have a back-to-back arrangement where they pass that liability onto the franchisee, ultimately that still needs to be enforced if things go wrong. Franchisee, closes shop, stops paying rent. The landlord's going to come after the bank guarantee. The landlord will come after the franchisor, and it's going to be on the franchisor to actually enforce against the franchisee. Some franchisors will actually will use a separate leasing entity that will hold all the leases of the particular site. Some actually go a step further and will have different entities, per lease or per state. The whole idea around that is to try and silo the risk of particular leases in smaller groups. Obviously, you've got to factor in the extra sort of cost and administrative burden of more entities, more reporting obligations. But it's definitely worth considering and looking at. Option two, where the franchisee holds the lease and the franchisor gets step-in rights. So the franchisor is the tenant under the lease. There'd be a separate document, deed of re-entry, step-in deed, tripartite deed, whatever you want to call it. Typically, it would basically give the franchisor a right to step into the lease in the event that the franchise agreement is terminated or expires, or if the franchisee is actually defaulted under the lease terms. Most of the time, landlords are going to require that for a franchisor to exercise that right, they would actually have to remedy the franchisee's default. So if there's rental, if there's a couple of months outstanding rent and they're in default on that basis, well, the franchisor is going to actually have to pay that to then be able to step in. And again, the franchisor would have back-to-back arrangements with their franchisee where they could look to enforce against that, but they'd obviously have to consider costs of enforcement, prospects of recovery if they were to do that. Look, this sort of option two is a really good middle ground. It means, franchisors don't hold direct liability, but they have the option to actually step in if they want to. one thing to be mindful of here is it's really hard to get landlords over the line to enter into these types of documents unless you're doing it at the start when the franchisee is actually negotiating the lease. It needs to be put forth. This is also a requirement that you do this. Once the lease is signed, it can be very difficult to get landlords to come to the table and actually enter into these deeds. Check I'm going for, okay, I'll sort of speed up because I think I've got 5 or 10 minutes on timing. Option 3, where the franchisee holds the lease and there's no step-in rights. As I mentioned, the simplest option, franchisee will hold the lease. There'll be no direct relationship or liability on the franchise between the franchisor and the landlord. The disadvantages of this, obviously, there's no control by the franchisor. Typically, you would see obligations under franchise agreements where the franchisee has to cooperate in trying to facilitating an assignment of the lease if the franchise agreement is expired or surrendered or terminated. But without any direct relationship or contract with the landlord, you're really at the mercy of the landlord. So it's just going to end up being a commercial negotiation with the landlord if a franchisor did want to pick up a site. Obviously, then the benefit of that obviously is the lowest administrative burden, the lowest cost option. So particularly a lot of new and emerging franchise systems, that's probably going to be how they start off, until they get to a point where they've got a few more team members at head office and more resources to actually go to that next step and bring in deeds of re-entry. All right, and so how do you determine which is the best fit, what leasing arrangement to apply to your franchise system? So some of the factors are going to favor a franchisor having lease control, whether that's holding the lease directly or at least having a step-in deed, as where the site locations are critical to your brand identity. They're prominent shopping center locations, they're substantive fit out. If there's high franchisee turnover or history of difficult terminations, often it's better to have control of that site, so you're sort of ready to go to either put in a new franchisee. If you're a franchisor that has the ability that runs corporate stores, then it's a big plus as well, because if you know you've got the capacity to put in a team and keep running it rather than having a store closure, it's a massive benefit to have that option. Go for time. Right, a few more minutes. Some of the franchise systems which may prefer not to actually hold the head leases. I mentioned sort of emerging early stage systems. You're going to have limited capital and resources. You're running on the smell of an oily rag often, so it's you're probably just going to go with the simplest approach where the franchisee holds it directly. Service-based franchises or anything where the premises is less critical, then it's really there's not much point in going to the actual cost or administrative burden of having that lease control. If there's low franchisee turnover and strong relationships, then you may want to avoid going to the extra administrative cost and burden as well. Skip through. All right, and then so some practical tips for franchisors around these sort of leasing arrangements, but really important. Oh, go back. Really important you are maintaining a register of all the franchise sites. Have something that shows all the key lease terms, critical dates, when it ends, what the renewal options are. Important that you develop a standard form sort of set of leasing requirements. Either both if you're holding the head lease as a franchisor or to pass on to franchisees. There's a bunch. I'll skip through. It's running short time. Some of the practical tips for franchisees. Obviously, go and obtain independent legal and financial advice before signing any lease. Really important you understand lease, you're aligning the lease term with the franchise term. I'd actually talk to the franchisor about amending the franchise agreement if you've ultimately signed a lease that doesn't align with your franchise terms. Really important you actually calculate what the full potential financial exposure is. Obviously, rent and outgoing is going to be and security are obvious, but turn your mind to make good. What's that's going to cost? Turn your mind to, okay, what happens if there's a midterm assignment or resale, what the incentive callback might look like. Try and negotiate down your personal guarantor exposure, and don't overcapitalize on the particular site. All right, so some of the key takeaways. Obviously, leasing arrangements, it needs careful consideration of the lease terms and the structure, and it's going to vary between different franchise systems. Your key provisions that we went through earlier, they're going to significantly affect your risk profile. Really important you understand what they are and negotiate those where able. I spoke to your 3 different structuring options. All right, we might close it there and jump into some Q&A. I think I went 2 minutes over, but that's all right.
No, you've done very well for a lawyer, Joel, to keep to timing. And guess what, everyone? This is for free. So,
but it's not legal advice.
Yeah. Please take advantage and ask Joel some questions. I know there was a lot of information there and a lot of questions that I had in my mind certainly were answered. But what questions have we got? If you don't want to type it, just take yourself off mute, ask the question.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions that they're not comfortable putting to the general forum, happy for you to reach out directly at any point as well.
Yep. When I send the recording, you will have all of Joel's and his team's details. Doug's got a question.
Yeah, what do we got? 2 questions. Comments worth mentioning the lease liability issues on the balance sheet. Contribution disclosure requirements. Who receives the benefit? Yeah, okay, so I presume Doug, I presume you're talking about the ownership of the fit out of where there is an element of landlord contribution. Yeah, so that's a good point. So when landlords agree to contributions, there's going to be different ways in which that's structured. Sometimes it's just a cash contribution. The franchisee or the tenant actually owns that fit out. Other times it's actually going to be owned by the landlord. And so yeah, obviously that is going to have an effect on how that shows up on your balance sheet. Look, wherever possible, obviously you want that fit out to be owned by you, because then it's going to sit on your balance sheet, as an asset.
Joel, just a comment.
Yeah.
So my first part of that was just for people that are considering holding the leases themselves as the franchisor, understanding the balance sheet liability and the impact that has from an IFRS and AASB perspective, that it actually could affect the franchisor's ability to borrow because that liability sits on their balance sheet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point.
Especially when you've got 400 leases.
Was that you, Charlie?
Yeah, that was Charlie.
Hey,
Yep,
Joel,
good
just
point, Charlie.
got a quick question, Joel.
Yeah.
How early is too early to start renegotiating a lease? We have leases coming to an end with no option on it at the moment.
Yeah.
Is it 12 months out we should be doing it? Is it 6 months? What's your timeframe recommendation?
Earlier the better. If there's no option term and you do want to, you're thinking you do want to stay in that site, you're better off starting negotiations as early as possible, because they can drag on. And if you're waiting for 6 months before expiry, that's going to could put you in a pretty precarious position where, you're a week out from expiry and you still don't know if you got to deal with the landlord on renewal, and if you're going to be hit with a 30-day notice.
Yeah, we've got a couple going month to month at the moment. That's why it's hard. It's hard. So thank you.
Yep, good questions. Any others?
I think Charlie's put his hand up.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm struggling to get off mute at the moment. Can I give a more Joel, I appreciate everything you've just said in terms of a lawyer's perspective on renewing a lease. However, from a commercial standpoint, you'll often not get a lot of traction from a major landlord, say Westfield, Stockland, until the last 30 days. There are all kinds of laws that say that both parties have to tell each other whether they want to enter negotiations within 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, whatever it says in the lease. But quite often we will engage early. Both sides will give notice to the other side as a matter of course. And then the real dealing doesn't get done until 3 weeks, 2 weeks towards the end, because from a landlord's perspective, if we tell them that, for example, unless you give us this number, we're leaving, it gives them 9 months to find someone else. From a landlord's perspective, on the other way, they may wish to lock us in early, but we want the best deal possible. So the real horse trading doesn't usually start till the last 30 days, just from a non-legal but commercial standpoint. Notwithstanding everything you said was correct, obviously.
Yeah, that's valid point too, Charlie.
Yeah.
Beg pardon, sorry, I missed that. I was trying to work out how to set my hand down.
No, I just said a valid point.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
Charlie, yes.
It happens occasionally.
Any other questions, peeps? I guess I think Joel did a great job of doing the complete summary. I mean, there's 3 options really, isn't there? And there's pros and cons for both. So we've got a few claps in the air on that note. Thank you very much, Joel, for leaning in and giving us.
If anyone wanted those slides as well, I'm happy to make them available. I know I sort of rushed through the end a little bit with timing restrictions.
No, that's fine. If you want to give them to me, Joel, when I send the recording,
yeah, perfect.
I can send the slide deck attached as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, so thank you from all of us. Thank you, Hitch. The Hitch team are on the call as well. And, great information. And if you want more, when I give you the recording, everything will be on it. So looking forward to the next 2 weeks. We have on Wednesday, the 4th of March, coming up, we've got our Platinum Partners Afterpay, talking about Afterpay Day and what's it all about and how does it help the merchants. So looking forward to that. Thank you all so much for taking time out on your lunch breaks. And thank you for those who take your cameras off. It's lovely to see your faces and hope to see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.